This is the PvE tier list early fall 2025 update. There's been some pretty big changes since the last time we had a PvE tier list, just because as Backlist of Cycle is gone, so there are a couple of units that are getting moved down or outright removed because of it. Trial of the Constellations is here instead, so we have a lot of new units popping into the tier list. And then we also have the addition of Otherworldly Hunt, which moves a few units up, but also the difficulty nerf on Hell difficulty means that a lot of units are moving down because you just don't need them to one-shot Hell difficulty anymore. Starting off with the S tier, it's still just the big three: Tamarin, Brieg, and Fene. These units just cover the widest variety of content, I would say. Tamarin, she's free. She covers mainly Ice and Dark Expedition is where she's best in slot. She's usable in Fire, but if you have Fene especially, you don't need her for Fire anymore. And then Earth, she's usable, but Mascot Hazel covers that. She's still good in stuff like Abyss and Story, and also every once in a while Hall of Trials, more like once in a blue moon, I would say. It's just anywhere you have like the classic need of healing attack buff and CR push, she's going to be really, really good there. And then we have Brieg, who's pretty much best in slot tank for 4 out of 5 expeditions, all of them except for Earth. And then besides that, you're going to use him sometimes in a couple of Abyss stages. I think he's pretty good there. Besides that, it's just his overall debuff consistency with his Strip, Death Break, and Speed Down, plus the Barrier, just gives him really, really good utility while still dishing out pretty decent damage if you build him with it. And then we have Fene. Fene, just an insane DPS, HP scaling, so she doesn't die too easily, but also with healing, so your DPS is healing everybody. Really, really nice. Just an absolutely insane unit. She's an amazing DPS for Fire, Ice, and Dark Expedition, also pretty good in Light. And then she's also able to solo on auto both Perdition and Nightmare difficulties for Magnar in Trial of the Constellations. Plus, she's good in Abyss. She's probably the only unit I would say is worth getting from Story Summon. I think every other unit just isn't really worth it. And then we have the A tier. The A tier, I would say, is a bunch of units that are pretty much free or easy to get, and they're definitely worth having built. Adventurer Ross, his S2 Soulburn is still really, really strong. Anytime you're manualing, I think he tends to perform better than Brieg, depending on what you're doing, just because of how good his being able to, every single turn, dual attack plus Death Break plus immunity buff. And then sometimes, if you're like really early on and you don't have Cecilia yet, he's a pretty decent substitute tank for Earth Expedition. And then we have Genesis Ross, a completely different unit, still Ross, but his damage is just absurdly high. Like, his S3 damage is ridiculous with its full Death Pen, plus he's HP scaling, so it's pretty hard for him to die, and he's debuff immune for his first 5 turns. He's going to be really good into stuff like one-shotting Wyvern and probably some of the other hunts, and he's pretty good in some Abyss stages as well. And then we have Mercedes. Mercedes, her usage at this point is really just Earth Expedition because of Vera getting removed, but I think she's still worth having built. She's a really good like early game AoE DPS, just when you don't have too many options. She's a good AoE DPS, and I think having Expedition one-shot setup is very valuable anyways, so I would definitely recommend building her. And then we have Mascot Hazel. Mascot Hazel, her whole thing is just, if it's a fire team, she's going to be really good there. Even if it's not a full fire team, if it's a piece of content where you're hard buffing a fire DPS, she's going to be really good there, which happens sometimes in Hall of Trials, where it's only your DPS that's fire. So we use her in Earth Expedition, we use her against Hooray in Trial of the Constellations, and we also use her for the early stages in Rift. I also think her kit in general is just really good for any future content. Anytime they ask for a full fire team, there's a really high chance that Hazel is going to be good there. And then we have Camilla, free unit, really, really strong dual attacker. On manual, you can S2 into S1 with permanent attack buff uptime, unless you get stripped or something. You can also Soulburn her S1 for 100% Death Break chance. Just really, really good support unit, especially on manual play for Abyss. Even if you're autoing the recent buffs that she's got, I guess they're not super recent anymore, but the last buff that she got made her cycling improve a lot, because she has permanent attack buff uptime. She still wastes a turn using S3, but you get 2 turns of dual attacks every time you S2, which is definitely worth it. She's really good for something like Light Expedition, and you could also use her in Fire Expedition if you need to. So she needs a different build for Light, and I think she's a lot stronger there. And then we have Commander Lorena. Even with Fene being out, Commander Lorena is still a really, really strong DPS, especially if you're just in the situation where you haven't really gotten to roll Fene. Commander Lorena does the job very, very well. Her recent buff, giving her a bunch of effects when she hits 200 FRES, combined with Christie's buff that makes her transfer 100% of her FRES, makes it pretty easy to hit the 200 FRES requirement, plus Commander Lorena having a free 550 FRES herself. And that's useful for cheesing a couple of Abyss floors, like 102, which is one of the most notorious floors. Really, really good DPS though, even on the stages or on bosses that block her max HP percent damage like function, she still deals a ridiculous amount of damage. Then we have Verdant Adden, story character that you get for free. It's her first form, Verdant. I don't recommend swapping to the other ones just because I think Verdant is really, really nice to have around. She just has such nice debuff utility while having pretty good damage. Death Break, speed down, strip unbuffable, and then also she has target weakness, which boosts everybody's damage dealt, and just her general damage mods are pretty high, especially on S3. I think she's really versatile, like debuff DPS, and definitely worth having, though a lot of people might have just swapped off of her at this point, and it's a pain to get her materials to swap back to her. And then we have Ios 2.0, who honestly might be a little bit high. Her main use is an Ice Expedition. I think she's just the best Deathbreaker slash attack buffer in Ice Expedition with her CR push and cleanse and also healing. One other thing that doesn't get used too much, but all of her like damage slash healing is on contact skills. There's no non-attack skills. This isn't too relevant, but just for like knowing if there's any boss that punishes non-attack skills, she'll be really good into that. And we also have this tier here, which is just the Rift tier. It's these 5 units plus these 2 units are the only Rift units, and these 5 are here specifically because if they show up on the tier list at all, they would be either lower or just not on. So these are only here while Fire Rift is here. Now we have the B tier. These are units that are good at some kind of PvE content. They're pretty much best in slot at something, so I keep them here, or they're just like stand out in some way, shape, or form. We have the Wyvern Core, Sigrid, Furious, Mui. These 3, you get them for free, and you kind of have to build them anyways, and it's not like they don't do their job, so we're going to put them over here. Not too much to say about them, they're just the generic Wyvern units. Acades, she's just such a strong healer. You use her pretty frequently in Hall of Trials, and especially early game, with Montmorency not really being in the sort of core progression, unless you have bad RNG with getting Acades, because it took me like half a year to get Acades on my alt account. Acades is just better. Her main downside is she's not as good on auto, but on manual play, when you S2 into her, she can just S2, S3, S2, S2, S3, and just spam S2, S3. A full AoE cleanse with big healing every other turn is insanely strong. And she's also used in Trial of the Constellations against Hurai. Then we have Cecilia. Cecilia just has a really strong combination of debuffs. Strip into attack down, into speed down, and then Death Break on her S1, plus the team immunity buff on her S3 is just really, really good. She's just a very versatile knight. And knight is relevant because a lot of bosses these days tend to do bad things if you don't have a knight in the front. She's mainly used in Earth Expedition, and also she can cover 2 of the 4 bosses in Hall of Trials, which is really, really nice. Not always guaranteed that you get to use her, just because sometimes the team restrictions don't allow for it, but she does have the mechanics to cover 2 of the 4. And then we have Frieren. Frieren, I think, doesn't really stand out as the best in slot in really any of the contents, but she's good slash very good at a lot of different things. So her versatility puts her up here, I think. You know, she can solo clear quite a few hunts, like Golem, Banshee on both Hell and Otherworldly. Also, I guess Azimanic, but please don't farm Azimanic. And she can also slot in as like an okay DPS on a couple of expeditions, like fire, ice, or light. So she's kind of just like an all-rounder that doesn't do anything super well, but that is still valuable in itself, just having a unit that covers a lot of things. And then we have Fenris. Fenris, he's really good DPS for ice and light expedition, I would say. Uh, Light expedition, you kind of want to run him with a dual attacker like Camilla, but really strong. Well, Camilla is also a free unit, so it's not too big of a deal. He's just really strong with the buffs that he got, and he's pretty good on Nightmare difficulty auto against Trial of the Constellations Aquina. We have Ball and Sezin. Ball and Sezin, great debuffer against Earth Expedition. He also just his general like debuff utility is just really strong. 90% chance to death break and speed down on his S3, which with Etika Scepter and average RNG, you can use it every other turn, which is really nice. Amon Okana, another Earth Expedition unit. She has pretty high dual attack chance, so anytime you use S1, there's a pretty good chance she's going to get to attack. And her S3 gives everybody speed buff, plus it dispels a buff. That's nice. Both of these units did pop up in a recent Hall of Trials, though it remains to be seen if that'll be a consistent thing, because they've only showed up once so far. Zealot Carmine Rose mainly acts as a replacement or alternative for Verdant add-in, just because, like I mentioned, a lot of people might have swapped off their Verdant add-ins already, in which case Zealot Carmine Rose is really nice for Light Expedition. I used to have her a little bit higher because you could use her in Secretary Vera as like the free-to-play option, but that's not really a thing anymore. I do think she's still just nice to have around, though. Arbiter Vildred, mainly just a PvE farmer for stages where you can one-shot, like Eulogy of a Saint. Pretty much the fastest farmer there. Archdemon Shadow, her S1 with her EE is really strong. It's just an unconditional dual attack. Like, it doesn't matter what happens. If she presses S1, she's going to dual attack. And then her S3, or dual attack with the high stack ally specifically. And then her S3, if you're manualing, it can death break, which is nice. She's mainly used in fire and dark expeditions, so I don't have her any higher than this, just because it's not that hard to one-shot fire expedition. Dark is a little bit harder, but it's definitely doable without Archdemon still. So that's why even though her unconditional dual attack is really strong, she's a little bit lower. If you're doing like actual hard content, somebody like Camilla tends to be better, just because you can just have her or somebody else give her attack buff, and then she also brings death break too. Thermia is a nice single target DPS, though we have some better options these days, like Fenris, Fene, and Commander Lorena are all really good. But Thermia is still okay. She's not bad, just a little bit outclassed, I would say, these days. Loka, I mentioned that Inos is kind of just a better version of her. Loka is used in Ice Expedition, and her kits work super well there. S2, CR push, attack buff, S3, speed buff your team, speed down, attack down, then S1 death break, but I think Inos is just better. Loka is still okay though, and being a 3-star, she is pretty cheap to build. We have Verwana here, who is the anti-counter slash dual slash extra attack unit. Right now, she is insanely good against Trial of the Constellations Aquina. I think she might be mandatory. I don't know how you clear that boss without her, to be honest. And her kit in general, even though sometimes the devs intentionally make it so she doesn't work, if they release bosses that proc her S2, then she'll be really strong there. She's been pretty consistently, like, will just randomly pop up sometimes, and randomly be good in certain PvE content. There's also Straze, still the hunt one-shot guy. With Genesis Ross being out, Genesis Ross can also one-shot a lot of hunts. But Straze does cover some things that Genesis Ross can't. Something like Golem, I would say, is where Straze shines a lot. So he's still pretty good, and also just if you want to, like, use your Genesis Ross for other stuff, and just have your Straze geared for the one-shot, you can do that. Aram, her S3 reset is really strong. If you just tune your units properly, you can make it so that they'll S3 and then Aram resets them, and then they'll S3 again. Like, I did a kill off for Wyvern one-shot where I would have somebody use their skill, then die to Wyvern, and then Aram would reset the DPS since there would only be one unit left, that sort of thing. And also, sometimes in like Hall of Trials, you can do some funny stuff with her S3 reset. Just because her S3 reset also pushes 100%, so it definitely enables a lot of little creative things. Really nice unit. A little bit, another 100% Def Pen unit, mainly for Banshee. I think she might be a little bit too high to be honest, but she is really good in Banshee, I guess. And her 100% Def Pen means that there might be some other places where we get to have some fun with her in the future. Vivian, free unit, probably worth having built. She's a solid AoE DPS with her 3-turn attack buff and immunity buff. Just nice to have around. She can still, for like Hell Golem or Hell Banshee, clear wave 1 for you if you need to. Charles, he's one of the primary units for Trial of the Constellations, Aquina, with Evelyn being the other one. But Charles is a little bit higher here just because he can also solo clear Banshee Hell in like 30 seconds. Plus, he is used in one of the 4 rotations for Hall of Trials. And then we also have B tier, or the B minus tier, rather. This tier is these are all good units, but the problem is that they are good in Trial of the Constellations, which is rotating content. In 3 months, we should probably see a completely new rotation, so we don't know who from here is still going to be good. Starting off with Magnar. Magnar is actually just here. It's just Fene. Fene solos it. Oops. Fene solos it completely, so there's like no consideration for Magnar here besides Fene. For Hoorays, we have Researcher Carrot, and then some combo of Aramp, Cadiz, Mascot Hazel, and Tamarin covers that. For Perdition difficulty, you have Tieria, who I have in the Grace of Growth tier, down here somewhere, because she's only needed 1 time in the whole season, so I don't have her in this tier. And then that's why Researcher Carrot's the only unit that's shown here. For Aquina, we have Evelyn, Charles, Violet, Young Senya, Command Model Leica, with Command Model Leica mainly just being a Perdition unit. But the other units would be stuff like Rowana, Fenris, or even Vivian work fine against Aquina. All of these light units here are against Rahel, some kind of cleanse, and then S1 Soulburn with a 10 souls, just something spammable pretty much. Ideally with a stun or a sleep, so you can kill the ads as well, which these 3 units all cover pretty well. Specimen Says, or Watcher Cherry, or Sage Ball and Sezin for Def Pen. And then also you want some sort of AoE, like hard CC. Sage Ball, General Purgus, ML Araminta. Last Rider Kraus is nice, because the boss does a lot of AoEs, so you can spam your AoEs back, and he has a little bit of Def Pen on his skills too. So these are just some of like the units that are pretty solid against that boss. And then against Ethel, we have All-Rounder Wanda, who is the pretty much free-to-play DPS for that boss. Shadow Knight Pills being the free-to-play cleanse/provoke. Alien Lua is the premium provoke. Lone Wolf Payra is the premium cleanse. And a couple of other provoke options and a couple of other DPS options here. But like I said, this is rotating content, so these units will maybe only be good for another 3 months. It depends how the season changes work. C+ tier is the Hall of Trials units. So these units are good, but the thing about Hall of Trials is that realistically, if you're just looking for top 5% or top 10%, you really don't need to try that hard. The cutoff is never that high. So even though these units are good, like if I was doing a top 100 tier list for Hall of Trials, it would look very, very different from this. But for top 5%, pretty much any of these units work. Supreme Purity Addon is listed just here mostly as a joke, because she is the strongest Hall of Trials unit of all time, but she's permanently banned in every single rotation. So it doesn't really matter if she's broken, if Smallgate never lets us use her, but she's gonna be here at the very top just because of how stupidly strong she is. Amelia, Doris, and I guess also Elena, plus Rowana, Cadiz, a little bit further up are some pretty common healers that pop up against some of the Hall of Trials bosses. It depends which boss you're fighting, really. Also Hazel sometimes. But they're just some of the healers that you'll see. And then let's go boss by boss. So Abyssal Euphene typically wants 4 debuffs, and then also AoEs. So Cecilia, I mentioned that she's using 2 bosses. Cecilia is really, really good here. She's got 2 debuffs on her S2, plus AoE S2 and AoE S3. Besides that, Araminta, Robin, Dizzy are some pretty common candidates for this slot, just because 2 debuffs on her S3, 3 debuffs on her S2, 3 debuffs on her S3, and then 2 AoEs, 2 AoEs, permanent AoE. Some other units, we had a couple of first timers in the last Ufine rotation, which was, I don't even think he's on here anymore, but Champion Zerato was a first timer. And then we also had Ball and Sezen plus Balmodal Kana as first timers. So we'll see if they ever repeat their appearances as good Hall Trials units. Next up for Astromancer Elena, we have two things. A unit with counterattack buff and AoE S1. For AoE S1, or for counterattack buff, we can do that first. There's Charles, who I mentioned up here, and then MLK Ron, Kikrat, Senya, Victorica. Victorica, Kikrat are pretty much the free-to-play options. And because the fight really wants you to AoE a bunch, typically we also want AoE on this slot, which is why I don't mention somebody like Ervelyn, because he only has single target attacks. And then for our AoE S1s, Yuna, Immortal Wukong, Abyssal Ufine, Bellion, some other stuff, Holiday Ufine, Afternoon Soak Flan, are some like lower end options. Typically, it's going to be one of these three, really, for the contenders for best in slot. And then Elena, I mentioned her with the healer group, but she only shows up against Arceti, and it's mainly to min-max for the attack percent imprint. Arceti herself doesn't really have any units listed here, just because I think she's the boss that changes the most. I think the only thing that's consistent there is that Ruana is really, really good. Besides that, her mechanic is you want strips. And there's infinite units with strips. Her actual break phase mechanic isn't anything super, like, what is the word, restrictive. There's a lot of creativity with her break phase, so we always get a bunch of different units being viable there, so that's why Arceti's got nothing here. Calric, Fairy Tail Tenebria, and Ufine, plus Cecilia, all the way up here, are units with AoE Provoke, Redirected Provoke, or Silence, and that is what Deathdealer Ray asks for. And then besides that, pretty consistently, that rotation also likes to ask you for a unit with super high attack stacking, which Sylvain Sage Vivian is the best in slot for that, which is why she's listed here. It's not guaranteed because it could be like sometimes they do def stacking or defense stacking rotations on some of the other ones, so it's very possible that Deathdealer Ray gets the same treatment every once in a while, but if it's ever attack stacking, Sylvain Sage Vivian is the best one. So then here is C tier. These are like alternatives to some of the B tier units. And the reason they're alternatives is just because they're not best in slot, like they're the alternative units, slightly worse, or they're just kind of overkill in some cases, where the amount of resources spent to enhance them is not really worth it. Free Spirit Theoria is the Arbiter Vildred replacement for anybody who took something like Ruel, with Ruel getting her new buff, or in case you got Grief, that took Spectre Tenebria, who has literally no use in PvE or PvP. Then you have Free Spirit Theoria as your Arbiter Vildred replacement. Ruzid is here. It's funny that he pops up again because I think he's good for Otherworldly Wyvern one-shot, but I don't think Otherworldly Wyvern one-shot is worth farming. So that's why he gets to be down here in C tier. He's just not really necessary. And there's probably some other units that can fulfill that role anyways. Midnight Gaul Lilius is for Katie's Otherworldly 100% one-shot, which I also don't think farming Katie's is that bad, to be honest. Because you have, I guess Torrent and Penset are both okay, but I don't like farming it that much, so I'm going to put her down here. Sinful Angelica, Ken, Conquer Lilius, Argent Waves, Hua Young, just a couple of Wyvern one-shot units you can use. The better options are already up there, so these are some of the alternatives. And then Soul Shadow Rose is for Golem Hell one-shot, just because I think Golem Hell with Wave 1, the old 3-man team was Soul, Shadow Rose, plus Vivian, or you would do something like Vivian and then Straze, Water Fury. The Genesis Straze isn't too good against Golem because there's 3 enemies on the field, but this is just like one of the possible teams there. Clarissa I have here listed above the other two just because with the difficulty nerf on Wyvern Hell, it's really easy to kill Wave 1 now, I think. And I don't think it's worth the waste of resources to obtain somebody like Seaside Bologna, who's pretty much completely useless. I'd rather just build Clarissa. Like, save yourself the bookmarks. This unit does absolutely nothing. And Clarissa will do a good enough job, plus she has attack percent imprint for your team. I mean your DPS, I guess. Bologna, you could probably still use her in Banshee. There's a lot of like easy ways to kill Banshee these days. like Straze or Lilibet, or if you're doing Hell, it's like Charles Fearon can post solo it. But Bellona can still do it too, probably. She has a decent kit for PvE in general, just with her like AoE Death Break and also her S1 being a built-in Daydream Choker plus proccing her S3. And she's got some decent AoE damage. I could see her popping up in the future for like some other new content or something. Tenebria is a Ball and Sezen alternative. You could use her in some Abyss floors too, though I don't really think she's needed in like that many floors. There's like, I think at this point we just have like better options for all of those floors. But if you don't have Ball and Sezen, or if you just don't want to build the guy, then Tenebria is his alternative for Earth Expedition. Cerise and Chloe are both units that are okay in my Expedition. I just think it's a little bit overkill. Cerise is, I would say, one of the best units for like Expedition, but you can definitely just get the job done with somebody like Camilla and Verdun Adden, and you'll be pretty much fine. Like, I use Cerise, but that's because I have her built from years ago. I wouldn't really recommend new people to obtain and build Cerise at this point. Chloe gets you a nice Death Break source and also pretty good damage, but same thing, she's just overkill, not worth investing in. Terran Guard is with a heavy heart that I have him this low, just because I think at this point, Abyss, you don't need him. You can just use Genesis Frost, you can use Commander Lorena, you can use Fene, and you're probably not really going to need Terran Guard, which is a little bit sad, but it is what it is. We have him down here instead. And then here for the D tier, I think some of these units are just like not needed anymore. Like Rem, SSB, Arya. I mentioned that SSB and Arya, just with how easy Wyvern Hell is, now I would just use Clarissa. This is like a waste of resources. And then Rem, just overkill. Hell Wyvern is just so easy to kill, it's not needed anymore. And plus she's not really obtainable anyways. Karin, same thing. Waste of resources if you're trying to one-shot with Sigrid. Pavel, again, overkill. You don't need him for Otherworld, and then for Hell, Charles can solo it. Leo, same thing, not needed. Alots was used for the Bologna setup for what is it called? For Banshee, but just like not really needed anymore. BBK Vildred are units for Asmanic, but nobody farms Asmanic, and you shouldn't either, so we have them down here. Sid, pretty decent DPS, but same thing with Ram. These were both DPSs for Ice Expedition, but the fact that Svene can also do Ice Expedition means that these guys get to be all the way down here. The Mercenary Helga, the comp that we use for Ice Expedition, has just kind of leaned away from the full Earth team, and we instead just use Tamarin, Brieg, and then Inos plus a DPS. Montmorency, they removed her from connections, and we get Brieg way too early for free now. So poor Montmorency is just kind of out of a job. Mainly if you didn't get to roll Acades and you got really unlucky, that's where you would use Montmorency. Grace of Growth for Abyss/Other is just units I think are kind of like one-offs. You don't really use them much besides like a single floor or something. Angelica is only for the early game. Once you get Brieg, you drop Angelica off a cliff. Asaria, with Nightmare Queen getting removed, I think she's actually lost like her main PvE usage. You could also use her in Cadiz. She's pretty good there, but I don't think Cadiz is really worth farming, is the problem. Asaria is still nice, especially in some Abyss floors, but you could use Grace of Growth for that, which is why I have her in the Grace of Growth tier. Plus, Asaria is still pretty good for story. Silvertide Christie, or Base Christie would work too, to be honest. Christie is just really, really good for giving Ephras to Commander Lorena. Like, I just did the 102 pretty much cheese with 3 stars, where Commander Lorena and Christie just obliterate the floor with Camilla and Ross. So I do think there might be potential for her to be a little bit higher up if we get more content where Lorena plus Christie is really, really good, but we're just going to have her here for now. Furia, use her once to clear Perdition difficulty, hooray, that's pretty much it. Curious, also just 2 Abyss floors. Only 1 Abyss floor at this point, actually. I think it's only 101 where we use her. I should start looking at some alternatives where we don't need her anymore, because we don't need her for 102 anymore. But yeah, just 101 at this point. Janelle, if you want the solo Banshee, that's pretty much it. Very slow solo, but Kitty Clarissa, I think she has an upgrade over Camilla on some Abyss floors, but kind of a waste of resources, so she's a Grace of Growth tier. Shuri, I used him for 102, but I guess he's not really needed anymore because we have the Lorena Christie comp, but we'll leave him here. Death Dealer Ray, used for floor 107 in Abyss. Destina and Ray, and I guess Bernard might be usable. Schneel is also used here, so Schneel, Ray, Destina, these three, used in floor 114 of Abyss. And then for Landy, she's used on a few Abyss floors, though not really mandatory. If you have her and you want to Grace of Growth her, you could use her, and that's fine. This is just a bunch of units that are only in Ancient Inheritance. You don't really see them anywhere else. And this is the Asmaclus Graveyard. This is pretty much all of the units that had some sort of decent usage in Asmaclus cycle and didn't find a new spot in the tier list anywhere after I resorted everything. That is it for the tier list update. A lot of changes. This looks pretty different from when I did it last time. Some new units came out that are pretty good, like Freeran, and just a lot of shuffling because of all the content changes. But that's it for this one, and I'll see you guys next time.